great, man. Where are you at the moment? Where are you actually? Oh, well, hang on. I should repackage that because sometimes you can say and sometimes you can't say where you are because we know you're in Ukraine. But what's happening at the moment? Where are you in Ukraine?
So I'm currently in Kramatorsk. Kramatorsk is a city in eastern Ukraine. So as you and your listeners probably know, Russia failed quite badly in its offensive on Kiev a couple of months ago, and it is now repositioning its forces to try and attack in eastern Ukraine,
Right.
where they think that they already controlled a lot of territory before the war, and they now want to kind of consolidate their control over. So I'm on the Ukrainian controlled portions of eastern Ukraine, which is where most of the big battles are going on at the moment. They're going on pretty close, where we're talking like
Let,
20, 30 kilometers away.
let's do this. We've done this numerous times before when I've been talking to you. So, Russian border, Ukraine here for people who are watching, not listening, and you're over in this region here somewhere, Eastern
So
Ukraine.
okay, yeah, just so stop the mouse a bit
Yep.
to the right. So Donetsk,
Donetsk.
yeah. So that's it. Yeah, yeah. So Donetsk. If you zoomed in a little bit, that city is has been Russian controlled. The one Donetsk for
Yep.
about for the last 8 years. But if you go slightly to the left of that,
Yep.
up, I think that's the what does that say that there?
That says it looks like POK
Oh,
Pokrovsk.
Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk. Okay, so I'm a little bit to the east of that.
Okay, so in this sort of region here.
Yeah, no, no, that sort of region,
All
basically.
right, so that's pretty bloody close to the Russian border, which is here, yeah. Even though you're saying it's the Ukrainian controlled area, that's within Kiwi, surely.
Definitely. It's the Russians' major target at this moment. Although no one expects them to be able to sort of do any sort of lightning strike like they did in Kiev. So if things went badly, we're pretty sure we'd know well in advance.
It's a mad world, and for people who don't know of the other product that I do, which is a daily news show, I've connected with you maybe a half dozen times on that to get like news
Yeah.
updates. But I really wanted to give us a bit of time to just I want to know more about you and what you do and what your life is and all that kind of thing. So that's what we're here today doing. And it's a mad world. Now journalism, my understanding, is not something that you were originally kind of trained in. Is that something you sort of picked up on the way and you've run with it? What's your background before getting to being a working journalist when it comes to learning about journalism?
Okay, so it is true. I've only really been a working kind of professional journalist for about the last year and a half, maybe 2 years.
Wow.
So I actually started out as I was a parliamentary researcher in Westminster. So just for the benefit of my background, I grew up in New Zealand. I lived there till I was about 19. Then I moved over to the UK for university. I did a lot of sort of student journalism and stuff in university, and I always thought it was in the back of my mind that I wanted to be a journalist. Then I ended up getting picked up for a gig that was basically a parliamentary researching job. And I was there for about 3 or 4 years. And then I moved on to becoming a journalist with a few other things along the way. But the job I was doing, like in Parliament, was pretty similar to what you do as a
Right.
journalist. Really, my boss was a former journalist. It was, interviewing people, writing reports, researching, speech writing, all of that sort of stuff.
All the
And
skill
so
set
the
needed.
skill, yeah, and I met a
Yeah.
lot of journalists in the job, so the skills were very transferable. And it's not like I decided one day I woke up, I was like, all right, I'm going to be a journalist. I sort of had about connections, even if I didn't have like formal training in the senses that a lot of people do.
Yeah, which I think in this day and age as well, when we are, we hear that phrase citizens journalists a lot, and not that that's what you are at all in the slightest, but I think with the age of the internet now and the age of social media and things like, blogs and substacks and various things, it's like the skills of a journalist, not to the level of, trained journalists, but seem to be a lot more attainable for the general public anyway. It seems that everyone can write a piece that can go to the world, and sometimes they do. And I don't think that qualified trained journalist is such the gold standard that maybe it once was. Not to take away from those who are, but that there are other people who have other skill sets that fit into that mold that go to war torn parts of the world and report to us to tell us what's going on, which is, I guess, the role of a journalist. You're telling the story for us to understand.
Okay, well, on that point, I actually think it's a really, really interesting point because so over the last couple of since about 2 weeks ago, I've been working with a young guy. Now he was actually originally a YouTube blogger, still
Mm.
is. However, he is like one of the people, like he's been all over the world, Libya, Syria, Yemen, not Syria, sorry, Lebanon. And now he actually, and you know, his channel is huge. He's got like 1.5 million subscribers. He gets like 5, 10 million views on all his videos. And I actually was working with him in Ukraine. By the strangest of coincidences, he is we went to primary school together,
Oh
and we
wow.
lost touch for about 20 years. Then I remember I saw some of his videos last year because they'd been places that I'd wanted to get involved in, and we sort of reconnected. And we ended up going to eastern Ukraine together, not where I am now, but Kharkiv when the battle was going on. And yeah, we got like right up to the front lines, and you know he did all of these like sort of amazing film shots. And I
Wow.
was like, yeah, he's not a trained journalist either, but he was producing, you know, it's real. What you know, I had a hand in it, so maybe it's a bit boastful, but some like really, really amazingly interesting content.
Yeah.
It's coming out every Sunday now, by the way. Maybe you can plug his channel later.
Yeah. Yeah. What's his name? Who is he? Well,
His
I'm
name's
not
Nick Fisher.
Nick.
Fisher, Fisher, and the
Yeah.
channel is called Indigo Traveler.
Uh, yeah, well, I've jotted it down, and I'll make sure we link it in the things as well, so other people can check it out. Yeah, so it's. I mean, the idea of the journalist in the past has been to tell the stories, and so the way you're doing that, I mean, it's. I was thinking as you were talking about, you've been kind of doing journalism as a full time paid employed kind of journalist for about a year and a half. Most people who are in a position of journalism for 18 months are probably still getting tea for their bosses. You're in Ukraine, as you just said, going to the front line. It's a pretty crazy story when you think about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, so there's a number of ways that sort of people get involved with this sort of stuff. One is sort of, you know, starting like with internships, you know, doing the tea runs and stuff, starting with internships, kind of then moving sort of slowly up the ladder until they get a posting out there. Another way is to kind of just dive in the deep end and start going to these places. Often you have to kind of self-fund it and maybe have a few commissions along the way and then just do it as kind of regular freelancing job, which is what I do. You know, like I'm now well at the stage where I make a sustainable income out of it, well, at least while I'm in Ukraine, because
Yeah.
it's so in demand at the moment. But yeah, a lot of people will just will come here as freelancers because they think they don't, you know, they don't necessarily want to go that like big, often quite grueling, quite underpaid and not very rewarding role, and they want to go straight to the action, so to speak. And there is a way to do that as well. There are skills to learn to know how to make that work, both you know, safety wise, financially, professionally, and so on.
When you and I have talked the last few times, I've kind of asked the question about danger and about situations happening through Ukraine, and you seem to have said most of the time you've been pretty, pretty good. But I think I saw a Instagram post of yours the other day where you went through a part of Ukraine 5 minutes after a massive explosion and an attack. How is it at the moment, safety wise? Are you still as safe as you ever were, albeit we know you're in a war zone, or have things gotten more hazardous and more dangerous at times for you, like at the moment?
So, for that, I'll go back to the start of like where we were on, say, February 24th. We were all in Kiev. And at the time, we thought that was like the most dangerous place to be in the world.
Yeah.
Now, there was not anything in the way. Well, like, you know, there were explosions, but they were usually in the distance. I think only one missile hit central Kiev. Yeah, that's the post there.
Yeah.
But we were all like, okay, you know, Kiev's going to fall within 3 or 4 days. We've got to get out of here. This is super, super, super dangerous. But as we found out, that never really happened. So the danger that we thought we were in, we weren't actually in. Now we've been doing a lot more stuff over the last couple of weeks with the Ukrainian military and that's included going out to their positions. You know, we as I said, we got an in one of their, you know, artillery positions out near Kharkiv. And so, yeah, we have been going to the more dangerous, like hotly contested places. I still see it as a controllable risk because we are going with the armed forces. The war isn't in this kind of crazy flux that it was at the start where no one
Yeah.
knew what was happening. Uh, but and it's also, I think that, you know, there just aren't a lot of like correspondents or freelancers out in these places. It is the coverage that's the most in demand, and it is some of the stories that need to be told the most. And it is possibly as well that perhaps as the war's gone on, we've gotten more used to it. Me and my colleagues' personal risk tolerances have just gone up.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you weigh that up? How do you weigh up, you know, because if it's in demand, it has a financial value to it. How do you weigh up in demand financial value to personal safety? Like, do you have an equation in your head that you kind of go, too risky, no money could get me there? Do you go like, you know, I do it for primarily for the pure journalism of it? How does that all work in your head when you're doing this?
I mean, there's definitely rates that I wouldn't take, but uh, often the financial part doesn't really. It's not a major factor in the equation. If I wanted to make money, there are other jobs I could do that I could make much
Sure.
more money than this. You know, like the last couple of months have easily been the most financially flush of my career, just as I said, because Ukraine is in so much demand. And you know, it's still barely anything on what my friends, my uni colleagues are all doing, like, you know, law, investment banking, consultancy, and stuff like that. If I wanted to be in something like that, I could make much more money than what I'm doing now.
Sure.
Yeah, a lot of it is. I don't want to say a lot of it is like the pure journalism, because that implies, you know, that's entirely selfless. So all I'm doing is like putting my life on the line to report to the world, which I guess is like true in a sense, but I don't want to say that that's like my only motivation. It's a job that's very rewarding. It's a job that in its way is very high status because, you know, it's the kind of thing that a lot of people are interested in hearing about and talking about. It's a very, you know, exciting and stimulating job to do. And it's also, you know, and it's quite a rewarding and meaningful job as well. So there's a lot of other things that play into it, and the financial equation is probably only a small part of that.
So it sounds like you're more saying sort of quality of story versus risk, and the money thing's not really part of the consideration. It's those two things you weigh up.
I mean, it is a consideration, but it's a secondary
Yeah,
consideration.
gotcha. While you're in Ukraine, and obviously previously because you've been in Afghanistan, some other areas as well, have you come across stories that you refused to tell?
Could you give me a bit more of a sort of clarification by refused?
I kind of wanted to leave it really open, but I'll try and nail it down a bit more. Like, I don't know, maybe a story you've come across that even though it would be a good story to tell, for some ethical reasons, for some personal reasons, for some professional reasons, you chose not to tell it. Does it ever happen that you come across, like, I mean, I don't know if this has ever happened, but if there was a situation that would be too impacting for someone to have their story told because it's a sad story or a bad story or whatever, do you ever find a conflict when it comes to, maybe I'm asking you about the ethical side of it as well on some level, where you come across good content, but you're like, no, it's just not, this is not my story to tell right now.
Um, hmm. I'm trying to think. Like, I think there are stories that I might not be like personally like the best person to tell. So, for
Gotcha.
instance, you know, one example was, you know, the constant reports of like sexual violence that came out after Russian occupation zones. That's something that I think is genuinely something that you should have some sort of like quite special, not necessarily specialist training in, but a better awareness of the sort of complexities of dealing with survivors than I necessarily do. And that's those are kind of stories that, while they're very important, I would probably prefer to refer to a colleague, you know, maybe a female colleague, as a plenty out here, to tell those, who could probably tell those stories more sensitively than me. I'm sure there have been occasions in the past where there's definitely been occasions where I've like interviewed people and they've said to me later, "Oh, actually, you know, I changed my mind." That happened to me once or twice in Afghanistan. I'd interviewed people who like, "Actually, I've changed my mind. Please don't like use my story or put my name on, and in that case, I just use them, like anonymously or
Right.
under maybe a pseudonym or something. Um, yeah, I'm sure there are. I wish I had like one specific example in mind, which is definitely something I have to weigh up. Um, yeah,
No, I get it.
sometimes ethical issues also come up around children, because to what extent should you be photographing or interviewing children? In
Yep.
some cases, we're talking about children also who have lost their homes or potentially lost their families. So there's a very important story there, but there's all these sort of thorny issues around whether children can really give consent to, or in the absence of their guardians. And yeah, as I said, I can't really think of one specific example. I'll get back to
Gotcha.
you if I can. Certainly a consideration.
Can you give us an idea of what, as a war correspondent, a war journalist, what your daily life looks like? Like, I know you were traveling or driving all day yesterday. We're recording this on Friday, your time, Friday, both of us, on Friday evening here, Friday morning there. What does your day look like in general as a war correspondent?
So, I hate to disappoint it. I wish I could say that every morning I wake up and we drive straight to the front line and we drive back under artillery fire. It's not really like that at all. In the end, my travel day got changed yesterday, and so we had a day that looked like anybody else who does a work from home job. We woke up, we all went to the cafe. We sat in the cafe and we worked and we typed up our stories and we started with some friends, and then we went home. The only difference is that whenever you step outside, you could hear the sort of thunder of army battles in the background. But other than that, pretty much completely normal. Now, some days, so for instance, what we try to do because we kind of divide our days into like writing days and work days, because you can't go out every day, you just get a bit exhausted. So,
Yeah.
we wake up in the morning, we'd say, okay, our plan for like today, for instance, is there's apparently been a Russian breakout near a small town called Popasna, and that is quite close to a sort of a regional, not capital, but sort of administrative center called Bakhmut. And we've heard that the Russians have gotten within like 15 kilometers of this town. And so what we're trying to do now today is we want to drive out to that town, and we want to talk to the people that we know there. Like, we know one of the deputy mayors there. We met a couple. We know the press spokesperson for the armed forces there. And we want to say, okay, is this true? Have the Russians really made these gains? What kind of preparations are you doing? Have they reached this certain area, or is this just all propaganda and stuff like that? And to do interviews. We know the place has been bombed a few times, so we try and talk to some of like the survivors of the bombing and stuff like that. Try and get as close as we can with it that isn't necessarily under direct fire, and then get back, spend a couple of hours writing it up or pitching it to editors, and kind of rinse, repeat. But that is only when we are actually in like one of the active hostility zones, like we are now. Like an
Right.
average day in Kiev would probably look pretty normal these days,
Yeah.
because Kiev is not really a war zone.
Is the world? I don't want to say is the world forgetting about Ukraine, because but is the world less interested in Ukraine today than it was 4 weeks ago? Are you finding that the demands for your time are easing off, or are we, the media, still as putting it up on the front page as much as we ever were?
So I think, like, objectively, you have to say the world's interest in Ukraine has gone down a little bit. Now, there are some justifiable reasons for that, I think. So, for instance, when the battle for Kiev was going on, or when the Russians invaded the first time,
Yep.
this was like genuinely on the level of like a fight for national survival. Okay, so this is one thing I think made the Ukraine conflict different, especially at the start. So India and Pakistan, for instance, they have a big beef over the status of Kashmir, whether it should be part of India, whether it should be part of Pakistan, who's being oppressed where, da 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 da. Now, if there was a war between India and Pakistan, it could get very, very violent, very, very bloody, but it would be primarily over the status of Kashmir. The
Right.
Russian aim in Ukraine at the start was Ukraine should not exist as an independent country. Vladimir Putin made that very, very clear that Ukraine was a fake country, that its citizens didn't deserve any sort of autonomy or anything like that, and was effectively trying to crush the government and institute a complete puppet government in Kiev. And so it was legitimately a fight for the survival of the nation. Now it's not quite like that. It's a fight over, specific areas of territory in eastern Ukraine that have been contested for quite a while. So while it's still very important, it doesn't kind of have it doesn't feel like it has those sort of earth-shattering stakes in the sense that it did a couple of months ago. People also naturally get people get tired of the same story. Like, it maybe shouldn't happen. It's an unfortunate fact of human nature that it does happen. And I can complain about that all I like, but we just kind of have to live with it. In terms of demand, we've actually not really felt like I'm getting probably less requests for like TV and radio hits, but I'm still selling all my stories, easily. Like the moment one client drops off, another client will come back. Like I've got maybe 4 big features, like I'm talking 1,500 word plus, coming out over the next week. I've got those videos I was telling you about that are cracking up hundreds of thousands of views. There's still really, really quite a big market for it, even if it's not the number one thing on everyone's minds, like it might have been in February, March.
I wonder if it's because television seems to be that medium of immediacy, the 6 p.m. news bulletin, what's leading, what's the big news story of the day. Whereas the written word, that you can give it a bit longer, a bit like a podcast perhaps. You can give it a bit longer, you can take a bit more time on it, so it's more digestible to sit and read with a coffee, whether it's from yesterday or a week ago, or I wonder if there's a difference. I don't know this, but I wonder if there's a difference there between the immediacy of radio and television versus the longevity of having something in writing that you can read over hours or days or weeks, and it makes it as valid as ever. I don't know.
I mean, well, I definitely do prefer longer form content. Like, I think if you want to do TV or radio, you need to have a very specific news angle. So I'm asked on TV or the radio, for instance, when something specific has happened. Okay, we want you on because Mariupol has just fallen. Tell us about what's happened there. And it doesn't really get you, if you're on TV for 5 minutes, doesn't really give you the chance. You say a few lines, it doesn't really give you the chance to sort of delve deep into these kind of topics. Whereas the written word is definitely much more interesting, and that's why also that's when my friend reached out and said that he wanted to do filming, long form films. He's pretty doing the total amount of content would be an hour and a half's worth of content. That's like a proper documentary. That's kind of what I'm focused on now, and that's what I think me and my colleagues are focused on. But that said, speaking of interest that people have in Ukraine, I wrote a long feature about 2 or 3 weeks ago for the London Evening Standard about it wasn't about the war, it was about what Kiev is like, the new normal in Kiev, getting back to normal. And I checked the social media stats, and it had something it had been liked or shared on Facebook something like 22,000 times, which was 10 times higher than any other piece they'd had that entire year. And so it's there's still very much is an interest in new and interesting angles in Ukraine, and I don't really think that will change.
I wonder if that speaks to the difference between the gatekeepers of the media and the consumers of the media. Maybe the interest hasn't dropped off for the consumer, the people who you're writing to, but maybe when the gatekeepers, the editors, the producers, the whatever, have to get airtime to 17 other stories, it falls down the list a bit. I don't know.
Yeah, I was talking to my friends who did the YouTube guy saying, and one thing I remember watching is he did a video on a slum in Nigeria that did 30-minute video, did 8 million views. Now, if you tried to pitch an editor for a major TV network or something like that, hey, I'm going to get you 10 million views on a documentary about a slum in Nigeria that no one's ever heard of, they would laugh you out of the room. And I think the point he was making is actually no, there still is an audience for a lot of this content that a lot of for whatever reason, editors and producers in the media haven't been able to tap into in the way that maybe they should have been.
And that's true. I mean, if you get success, like YouTube is the biggest television channel in the world, and if you get success in some with content that can be consumed and is attracted to many demographics around the world, tens, hundreds, literally billions of views if it's the right thing. So yeah, it's always fascinating. I find it fascinating looking at the media model here, that because I live in Dunedin, our biggest radio stations in Dunedin have like about 15,000 listeners, and those stations still make $1 million a year profit sort of thing, whereas some YouTuber in his bedroom down in Invercargill can have 15,000 subscribers and be having more views than those radio stations have listens. And it's just working out that model and how to make that model financially rewardable for the guy in his bedroom, because he's speaking to as many people, perhaps more than the monolith of mainstream media through the local radio station. And then of course multiply that by national radio station, international radio station. But then you look at guys like, I mean, it's a silly example because it's not news, but the Mr. Beasts of this world with 100 million subscribers on YouTube, and no television network in the world or film in the world could get close to the numbers he does every single week. It's fascinating.
Yeah. But also remember, he's at the very top of a very large pyramid. There are plenty of people who might, even if they do those views, have no ability to monetize it and can't really get anywhere. So
whilst you've talked about him a couple of times, I thought maybe we should also bring up Nick's video. This is the Indigo Traveller that you're talking about.
Yeah. So if you have a look down at one of the more recent videos,
yep.
That one there. That one's the one that the first one we did. I don't really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's good to put it out there.
Pardon?
It's good to put it out there. And for people who are listening to the audio version of this, Indigo Traveller, INDIGO Traveller on YouTube, and I've bookmarked that already, and I'll go and have a look at some of those at a later stage over the next wee while. So you feature in a few of those as well, or are you more behind the camera just helping him make it?
I worked with him. He did about 6 videos. He's releasing one a week, and I'm in the latter half because I traveled with him when he went to Kharkiv. Yep. And we covered the sort of the humanitarian situation there, the Battle of Kharkiv, and so on and so forth.
When we've talked in the past, one of the conversations that have come up, particularly around Ukraine, is the dis and misinformation going into Russia, and the citizens of Russia basically not knowing what's been going on. And I spoke to Ina Soufsan as well. I did a news item with her from Ukraine, and she was telling me similar things. Because it's been going on as long as it has that changed at all? Or is the disinformation going through Russian citizens as much as it ever was?
Okay, so look, as I said, the big thing that has always shocked me, it's like, okay, we know Russia is full of propaganda. Also, by the way, I should point out, like, there is propaganda on the Ukrainian side as well.
Sure.
It's not the same sort of extent, but I could give you like one or two examples of like when the Ukrainian government would say something, and I'm like, yeah, we just know that's not true, or at least very much twisting the facts.
Yeah.
For instance, I'll give you one example, is that they often say that, it's everything the Russians target is purely civilian infrastructure. And that's often the case, but, we just did go to a building that we've been told was purely civilian infrastructure that the Russians had targeted with a missile. I'm not going to say where.
Sure.
And it was brimming with soldiers, and there was a military HQ in the basement. So, that's an example, right? And I can see why they say the things that they say, but it's like, again, they are still a government at war with particular political objectives, and however much you might agree with those objectives, they're still not going to be, entirely true. Not everything they say isn't going to be entirely true. Now, I think the big thing that always shocked me with Russia was the fact that you find this a lot the further east you go, where people have more like kind of linguistic or cultural familial ties with Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Is that they would always say that they would be calling, we've been out into a little village and we talked to like an old man who'd literally lived through the Second World War. This guy was 85, I think, literally lived through the Second World War. And he said that his son in Russia just was like, no, you're lying. There's nothing going on in Ukraine.
Wow.
Like a targeted military operation, da-da-da-da-da-da. That's a story that literally every single person who goes to Kharkiv or Eastern Ukraine has heard. our family in Russia do not believe this is happening. And that's what I think has always been some of the most striking points. One of the other things as well is that there was there was a huge big exodus from Russia in about the first month of the war, where a lot of like the sort of affluent young upper middle class professional class kind of just all left in their droves. They were like, right, this society is going a completely different direction than we want. It's getting super oppressive. So they went to places like Armenia, Georgia, Turkey, Serbia, a few others, but they were the main one, and Central Asia as well. And those are the main places. But what that's kind of meant is that what's very good for those people, it means that Russia has lost anything that could be like the center of like a sort of an anti-war or sort of protest movement.
Gotcha.
That said, I still do have, the occasional friends in Russia. I've got one friend, she lives in the very far east of Russia, and she, is still, using the band app. She's still like, I still take her on Instagram. She sends me photos of where literally people will like write Ukrainian slogans and stuff like that. She's always said, I'm completely against the war and I always will be. I have heard that apparently, and it's not like I can quote studies on this, at the far east of Russia, people further away from the war and they're less affected by propaganda. It doesn't seem like that's made much of an impact. The one thing that is seeming to get through is the fact to people is, even of people who support the war in Russia, I think people are starting to get the idea that the Russian military's made a lot of serious blunders and that Vladimir Putin's war is not going well.
For sure. We're also hearing, and I don't know if this is a rumor or not or conjecture, but there seems to be word going around that Vladimir Putin might be quite ill. Do you think this is propaganda, or could there be some truth in that?
I mean, this is one of those kind of armchair speculation things. Sure. That's kind of fun to do, but never, like I look at the photos of him, he doesn't look great. He's all puffy. He's kind of got this like horrific expression on his face. He's got those ones where he's like grabbing the table and like looks, he looks pretty terrible. And you've got to also think the Kremlin are the ones taking all these photos, like his photography team, and the best photos they can put out of him are dire. There's got to be something going on there. It doesn't sound like propaganda to me, but I've no evidence either way to say yes.
Of course. No. It just didn't make me think. It made me think. I wonder if some people who think they've got a job to do before they go, and he's made it pretty clear that Ukraine has always been part of Russia. And if there was something going on with his health, I wonder if it was something he wanted to do before he went, sort of thing. But again, complete speculation. Have no idea, but it was just that thought that went through the mind. What about in Russia? That story that's come out with the results of the war crime. Russian soldier asked Ukrainian widow to forgive him during first war crimes trial, and I believe he admitted guilt. I know you're not a Russian expert and you're not in Russia, but I'm sure obviously the Ukrainian people see this. Is this kind of stuff getting through to Russia at all, do you think? Do you have any knowledge of that?
I mean, so this only came out over the last day or two. I think the Russian embassy just put up a statement saying, this will be like a sort of a fake mock trial. And
right.
And to be honest, like all of the talks of like war crimes that are going on in Ukraine right now, they're all focused on the people that they picked up in Mariupol, right? Like the defenders of Azovstal. They're going to be the ones who, like, if there's going to be any mock trials of people talking about war crimes, they're going to be talking about it from, all of the Russian media attention is going to be focused on the guys who were in Mariupol, who, that's the big story in Russia now. And it's like, the capture of Mariupol and the surrender of those guys.
Yeah, just I would just to get you to maybe come a bit closer to the mic as well. The camera was, the mic was just being a little bit softer, but that's fine. Look, there's lots of other stuff to talk about. I kind of said you would talk more generally, but we are talking a lot about Ukraine. But I guess that's par for the course. But something that I saw on your Instagram that is a personal thing from you. You got some new ink.
Yeah, I did indeed.
And you got some new ink in Ukraine. Tell me about it. Tell me about why, and also what it actually is. This a location 22? Tell me about the new ink.
Okay, so that what it says there, you can see the letters. Don't know if you can see much.
Yep. Can see that.
This is the that's Cyrillic, the Russian Ukrainian alphabet for Kharkiv, the second city of Ukraine. And I remember what happened is that I went to I first went there in March just for a day to do like a story about what was going on. And we went to like a volunteer center where, a volunteer kitchen. And we met this couple, and this couple owned a tattoo studio. And they pointed to my, like, the Mari tattoo on my left arm. They said, "Oh, that's a really cool tattoo. If you ever want a tattoo, hit us up when you come back to Kharkiv." And I was like, I actually thought that would be a cool idea, like an
Yeah.
interesting souvenir to get from Ukraine, and sort of, the tattoo parlor was kind of turned into a shelter and stuff like that. So yeah, I decided to go there and talk to them about what I wanted. The building itself is a quite famous monument in Kharkiv. And as you can see, like on the one half, in the finished version, it's half on fire. To sort of symbolize what's kind of been happening in the city. It was a city that I spent quite a long time in, and that I developed quite a lot of close connections, and that kind of felt very close to me. So decided to get it permanent.
How did the locals feel? How did the tattoo artists feel about, they're making a permanent piece of art on some level commemorating their city burning? Was there any kind of conversation with you and them about that as they were doing it?
No, I mean, so that they suggested that particular design, and I said
Cool.
that looked really cool, and I liked it, and I think that was what they wanted to do. I think for them, I've had a lot of Ukrainians stop me and be like, "Oh, that's so cool." I'd probably like a dozen or so be like, "Oh, let me take a photo of it," and stuff like that. So I think it's the kind of thing they really like. I think they like the idea. Because obviously, often what will happen with war zones, right, is that people come in briefly, do the story, and get out, and they do like the sort of symbols that people are a little bit more committed than maybe they usually are.
I'm interested about the locals. I'm interested about how the locals treat and talk to you. I mean, when the locals see you dressed like this, you're obviously you're not from around there. You're not dressed in army fatigues. You're not dressed in local gear, but you've got protection on. How are you received by the locals as you're in and around the town? Like the interaction you had with the tattoo artist or the tattoo parlor, sounds like they were all, they were like, "Come on in, we want to help, we want to be a part, we want you to remember us," and that sort of thing. So, what's your daily interaction like with the people, the Ukrainians?
Okay, so I'd say like 95% of the experiences are positive. Occasionally, so we have to take a sort of slight step back and say that Ukrainians do like foreign journalists being here,
Yeah.
and there is a very direct causal link. It's because they're being supplied with a lot of weapons by the West, and the more media attention from Ukraine, they see kind of a direct causal link to them being able to fight back against the Russians. So it's not entirely just because they like us on a personal level or something. But I have had some very scary experiences with, I don't know if I told you about it on the podcast, on one of the shows, that when I was first in Kharkiv, of all places, I had a really, really drunk, like, cop come up to me and literally point his gun at my head and be like, "What?" Yelling in Russian, and I've got someone translating, "Why do you have a camera with you? Why are you taking photos? Why are you doing interviews?" I think I did tell you about this.
Yeah, I think you
And
might
so
have.
it's mostly very positive, but yeah, there are some negative experiences as well. Some people really don't like journalists. We went to a hospital, for instance, the other day to do, we asked to go and see if we could talk to a few of the injured people, and one of the commandants comes out, he starts yelling at his subordinates, like, "I've told you so many times, no journalists, no photos, no nothing," motions at us to get out and stuff like that. So, it is what it is. Some people be really, really keen to have you and take you around. Like, for instance, we found one guy here, like literally we just met a friend of his in a coffee shop, and he was like, "Oh, you should text this guy who does like volunteer work." And he's like, "Okay, I'm doing a volunteer run to to Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, which are like really, really badly besieged cities in the area. Like the place I'm in really is absolutely nothing in comparison to them." Yeah, he just organized us a car, organized us a military driver that we were going out with. We roll up to the checkpoints, the guy would just say the password and we go straight in. And yeah, or like we gave him gas money, but other than that, he just organized us a massive press trip for completely free. And yeah, so there's a lot of generosity as well.
How does this all finish? Oh, it's a bit of maybe a bit of a weird question, but from the outside looking in, I'm like, what's going to happen here? What's next for Ukraine and Russia? What's it going to be like in a month? What's it going to be like in 6 months? From the inside looking out, what happens? How does this finish? How does this wrap up? What's the when I say the final chapter, I don't mean in the country, but in this conflict. What's the final chapter going to be?
Yeah, it's all kind of reading the runes, really. I mean, so it's looking good. The thing is that it's looking good for the Ukrainians on a number of fronts. It's not looking particularly good here. You know, like the Ukrainians managed to take back most of Kharkiv. Maybe they'll be able to threaten the Russian headquarters in Izium quite soon. But that said, it does look like the Russians are sort of making slow and incremental gains here. It may literally just come down to which army runs out of men and ammunition. I should say women as well, because I've seen plenty of women fight here as well. We met
Right.
a woman who was a sniper on the front when we went to some of the trenches a couple of days ago, and it's also, I think sometimes when it's on the ground, you've got a very good perception of what's going on immediately around you, but you can sometimes it's quite difficult to zoom out and see the sort of the wider strategic picture. I mean, I assume that what will probably happen is, you know, the Russian army is pretty deficient in morale. Its logistics chains have been a bit of a mess. I would probably go with the idea that they will collapse at some point, and that Ukrainians will probably at least be able to push them to the pre-war, like February 23rd borders, but that is pure speculation. And
Yeah.
it could be that the Russians have actually gotten their act together and that they will at least be able to take this part of eastern Ukraine that they want to take.
Yeah. When you're wandering around Ukraine, when you're wandering around the cities and the towns, when you're talking to the locals and stuff, are there any new conversations happening right now than compared to, say, a month or 2 months ago? Like, I don't know if this was a conversation amongst the citizens previously, but we're hearing, Finland and other countries in Scandinavia talking about NATO and stuff now getting on board. Obviously, Ukraine can't get on board with NATO now because if they do, that means NATO's in a war immediately. So there has to be some kind of point. I'm not sure. I'm not even necessarily asking what are the locals saying about NATO, but I'm like, are there new conversations coming up that you're hearing because of the conflict today that you weren't hearing at the start of the conflict?
So, I mean, one thing that you didn't hear at the start of the conflict, people were just talking about, pure survival. Now
Yeah.
people are a lot more likely to talk about, the very genuine possibility of sort of Ukrainian victory. At the start of the conflict, people were leaving Ukraine and they thought they might never come back. Now people are often, having their discussions about, I've met back in Kiev, a lot of people have come back. I'm talking to people, all the time, friends of mine who left, who are talking about, oh, maybe I'll come back in a few days, maybe I'll come back in 6 months. I don't really know. So that's one conversation people are definitely
Yeah.
sort of getting back to their normal lives. So I posted a few photos on Instagram, and I talked about it a bit on Twitter about the metro stations underneath Kharkiv, where I did a lot of reporting from. And one thing that was obviously very distressing, but it was quite interesting, was the fact that I was talking to one of the girls who'd been like an organizer of the metro station. So like one of the people said, kind of, yeah, that's the one. And she actually said, I was talking to her the other day. She sent me a voice note saying, "Look, it's really, really weird. We've kind of forgotten. We've been down here for so long, and lives have been, down in the shelter. It's a little bit like, what can sometimes happen to people when they get out of prison. They've kind of forgotten how to live their normal lives, go back to their normal lives.
Yeah.
She's
Wow.
like, I live alone, and I went from living alone to being surrounded and being responsible for 500 people, and now I'm going back to kind of my old life, and I don't really know how to do it. And a lot of people, some of them, their houses are all have been like damaged and destroyed, and they don't, they can go back to a house that's like half wrecked, and it's going to take ages to reconstruct because Kharkiv was really, really, really badly damaged. And so that's another conversation that's certainly coming up about like
Wow.
how do we go back to our normal lives now after the kind of craziness we've experienced.
That means the locals can see an end, because if they're talking about how do we go back to it, that implies once this is over, perhaps on day one they were just living in the now, surviving the immediate, but now they're thinking about it. They're having conversations about the future and what that will be and what that will look like.
Yeah, definitely, definitely, and also it is because because the Kremlin has kind of scaled down its war aims, and its war aims are now focused on southern and eastern Ukraine, Mariupol, which they captured, and the Donbass, the rest of the Donbass. So where I am now, and a lot of people do see those regions as while they're invested emotionally in the Ukrainian war effort, they don't see the battles here as directly relevant to their lives as they did the battles for the majors for the really big cities.
I'm interested for you as well where home is for you right now. And that's based on what you just said a few minutes ago when you talked about I've got some friends who are coming back who said they'll now come back. It sounds like what you're talking about is Ukrainians who are coming back who will think about coming back to Ukraine. It almost sounds like you're speaking like a local yourself. Like I know you've left New Zealand, you're living in the UK. Like, do you have a home right now, or are you no fixed abode and you go where the work is?
It's kind of a bit of both, I guess. Technically my base would be in London, but as I said, I've now got a flat in Kiev. I've been here for God nearly 4 months. I'm planning to leave just to take a holiday in a couple of weeks because I haven't really had very much of a break since the start of the war. But yeah, it does kind of feel like my life and my work right at least for right now is in Ukraine. And I
Right.
had the same thing when I covered like the first conflict I covered was Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan. I remember I ended up perching up in Armenia for about 3 months. And yeah, that kind of felt like it became a home. But then, when the conflict stopped, my work there completely dried up. So I didn't really have any more. Whereas it doesn't look like Ukraine will dry up in that same sense. It will kind of rumble on. It will still, I think, always be newsworthy.
Right. Where's Fano? Where's family for you right now? Are they in New Zealand
Mostly in
still?
mostly in New
Okay.
Zealand still. That's my family's is from and lives in Christchurch. I've got a few cousins and stuff in London though.
If you needed to get home for some reason, I'm using the word home, you just haven't. If you needed to get back to New Zealand for some reason, is the infrastructure there in Ukraine and around the borders that you could get out of Ukraine in 24, 48 hours if you needed to?
Probably. So
Yeah.
one thing that's been absolutely amazing is how efficiently the Ukrainian train systems have run.
Right.
These were trains that were like evacuating literally these trains evacuated millions of people. I think there was like a very very funny sort of these two tweets that people put beside them. Like one was, hi, British Rail is sorry that there's like a 2 hour delay on the trains today because of bad weather, and the other one said Ukrainian Railways is sorry that due to Russian destruction of railway tracks, there's a 90-minute delay, that kind of thing. But yeah, the rail infrastructure in Ukraine has just been incredible. All the trains run on time and reliably, and still even during the war. So I mean, getting out of here is a little bit dicey just because you need to find a driver.
Yep.
But if once you're anywhere west of where I am, if you're in Kiev or Odessa or even Kharkiv or one of the big cities, you just jump on a train and you'll be over the Polish border and the Polish, Moldovan, Hungarian border in 15 hours.
Nice. All right. What about Fano back in New Zealand? How often are you in touch with them?
I mean, I'm sure they wish more regularly, but like regularly, I think.
They're all on WhatsApp. That's the easiest, isn't it? Just a WhatsApp tweet. How you doing?
Yeah,
Morning.
exactly, exactly.
And what about being in war-torn Ukraine and other war-torn parts of the world? Is there anything outside of that life you're living now that you really miss? Whether it was from being back in the UK or back in New Zealand or wherever the last point of home is. What do you, if you close your eyes and you go, I wish I could have or do whatever those things are, is there anything that comes to mind?
Um, I mean, there is something like kind of nice about like sort of. So one thing that like Ukraine often can feel like war-torn countries can feel like is it can feel like a little bit in the middle of COVID, right? When there's a lot of restrictions on what you can do, where you can go, who you can talk to, and obviously they're for completely different reasons, but there's still like a nightly curfew and there's loads of places that are sort of closed. And so that's what I kind of remember when I went, because I left Ukraine for like a short break a couple of months ago,
Yep.
end of March. And, being able to go to Warsaw and just being able to go down the street and, and like because I would keep thinking I would like see, I don't know, Polish police or something, and I'd be like, oh shit, okay, where's my passport? Because they're going to stop me and they're going to ask for my accreditation details and stuff like that. Of course, I'm thinking that I'm still in Ukraine. I think that kind of constant living without sort of, looking over your shoulder about the rules, or having to sort of take your sort of personal, have to constantly make small safety calculations. That's certainly something.
I was just thinking as well. It's been a bit random, jumpy around conversation we've had today, but I was thinking you are a journalist. You're in a war-torn zone. You've done work, journalist type work, back in places like London, as you were talking about earlier. What do you think? What have you learned about the skill set of a journalist being in Ukraine that you didn't know previously? Like, if there was a journalist sitting in, let's say, Christchurch today, watching this conversation, what do you think, if anything, they don't know about journalism that maybe you've learnt whilst doing this crazy mad life you're living?
So one thing that I can think of two things that
Cool.
I'd recommend. One is that the sort of advantages that you can get from the people that you would sort of least expect. Like, there are so many occasions where I have literally just met someone really, really casually in a park, or in a bar, or whatever, and they have turned out to be a really, really useful contact in ways that I had no idea that they would be in the past. Whether they've been able to organize fixes, whether they've been able to, like, as I said, that guy that we literally just randomly met in the cafe, who
Yeah.
said, "Oh yeah, my friend organizes this," and who was able to get us like really, really close to the action and get some like amazing footage and photography and stuff. There's that, the kind of idea that everybody has and they often have like really amazing and interesting stories to tell. And I think that some people, it's especially that happens to journalists, just come in and they're like, right, I want to talk to the politicians and the generals and stuff like that. Often those people are either very tight-lipped or really actually quite boring. So it's learning to kind of make those sort of friends and connections, and be open to talk to people you wouldn't expect. Second, I think, would be the importance of like dealing with your colleagues in this profession, and having a sort of a crew, because it's really difficult to do this job alone. Like, when I was in Afghanistan, I didn't really know anybody there, and I traveled mostly by myself, or with just like a local fixer. And not only is it more expensive, the work is much harder. It's less rewarding because you don't have anyone to share it with. Where it was, as I've been here, I've been having, I've probably, had 5 or 6 different like travel companions right now, where there's a group of 4 guys that I'm traveling with, me and 3 others. And that makes it much, much easier, not just in terms of cost sharing, but in terms of having sort of like moral and emotional support for stuff that you're going through. And also, it does make this life feel a lot less crazy, right? So, if you're having your after work conversations, I sometimes I can go back to London or something, and I just feel crazy because people be like, oh yeah, I had a really difficult day at work. It's like, my boss was a dickhead, and I'm like, okay, I had a difficult day at work because we had like a artillery shell hit
Yeah.
200 meters away from us, and all the cars next to us were on fire and stuff like that. But when you're talking to people, and like, we talk to people here, like, there's a kind of a, because everyone stays in this one hotel, so there's now a bit of a community here. And so, we'll all get home. Oh, so what did you do today? With one guy, like, oh yeah, so I went to the front line in like a Ukrainian armored vehicle, and like there's explosions and stuff going all around us. What did you do? Oh yeah, we went to a basement to like evacuate civilians and stuff like that. So it sounds crazy listening to, but it comes very, very. It makes you feel a lot more normal, if you know what I mean, because it's. And the other thing I think is that if you meet a lot of these people, yeah, they're pretty out there people, but they're all sort of, a lot of them are quite like young, like, I think late 20s, early 30s is definitely the age of a lot of people here. They're quite like relatable people, and so if you came here and just sat around and had drinks with us or whatever, you wouldn't think that we're like completely different and crazy to the people you meet back home. I know that was a bit of a rambling answer, but I hope it sort of answers.
Do you have any concerns? Because you've said this to me before about things being normalized. I remember you talking about the the shots of the over the head just kind of becoming white noise in the background of bullets flying around. is there any part of you that has a concern about getting used to that level of adrenaline in your system all the time? You know, you hear stories about soldiers going home from war and not being able to kind of settle because they're now so heightened that everything is an attack or everything is an issue. Or so you know, is that something that concerns you in any way?
I mean, it's in one way, it's almost kind of too early to tell. So, like for instance, like I remember, as I said, the first day I left Ukraine, I got to Krakow, and there were fireworks going on, and like I just assumed, I just heard the bang. I was like, oh, that's just artillery, right? Like that's my first thought, and I'm not even like scared or panicky about it. I'm like, oh, it's artillery. It's like I hear it here all the time, like constantly. It hasn't you know, we woke up this morning just before I turned it on. You know, we could hear like artillery shelling, and it is just kind of completely normal. And yeah, I guess it is a concern. You know, there are certainly people who, you know, they do this job and they find that there's no other job that quite does it for them in the same sort
Yeah.
of way. That's why they come back. I guess it's kind of one of those that sort of I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. As I said, I'll probably leave. Think about maybe that next weekend or so. I was thinking probably I'd take a solid month out, just do some normal stuff. Maybe, you know, maybe I'll do some reporting on, like, you know, the refugee situation, or probably going to go to the NATO conference in Madrid and stuff like that. You know, still working, but slightly lower down on that.
It is kind of funny, and I don't mean it in a dismissive way, to hear you talking about I'm going to do some normal stuff, reporting on NATO, reporting on refugees, whereas most people go, I'm going to do some normal stuff. I'll go lay by a pool for a while, and your normal seems very abnormal, I think, to the to the rest of the world.
Yeah. So I mean, I said something to someone once. It was to Nick. He kind of asked, and I guess it's, if you want to think about like how normalized it is, he's like, so when you go to like the front line or you go into one of these dangerous places, like, are you scared? And the answer is yes, but you're about as scared as you are when you go to the dentist.
Okay.
Like, and you know you've got like a like you've got to have like a tooth out or a filling or something. It's like that level of. I don't mean to sound like sort of dismissive, but that is like legitimately about the level of anxiety or fear that you have.
But what about the very first time you went to the front? Was it the same? Or I guess I have to go back a couple, because Afghanistan, think about the first time you went to a front. What was that feel like?
Was in also Afghanistan actually wasn't really that close to any of the
Right.
fighting at any point. But in Karabakh back in 2020, yeah, the first time, because the first time I was in Karabakh, yeah, we got really close, and there was, and the thing is, one of the differences was the Armenians were like completely collapsing, and we were on the Armenian side of the conflict. And, you know, there was literally artillery shelling. And yeah, it really was quite frightening, quite shocking. It was the scariest thing I've sort of had probably ever experienced in my life. But then that became normal. And then, as I said, the more you do it, the more it just, you know, okay, I got through that one fine, I'll get to the next one fine. And you sort of stop feeling that kind of fear in the same sort of way. I don't want to say I'm sitting here like, oh, look at me, I'm so brave and courageous, but your tolerance for that sort of fear just kind of naturally.
It's because your circumstances have been normalized. That's what you're saying.
Exactly. Circumstances have been normal. And as I said, having so many other people around you who are doing the exact same things, it makes it feel like a much more normal endeavor than it might sound to anyone sort of outside.
Hey, Tom, it's been a great amount of pleasure to catch up with you. We probably talked more about Ukraine than I thought we were going to, but you can't not. You know, it's where you are. If people want to find out more about you, Tom the Scribe is your Twitter bio, and your NT Much on Instagram, on the gram as it is. Some good looking photos there and some interesting things. And it's just you flick through your Instagram, and I think it was on your Twitter feed, and I think it was last time we talked, which was probably a month or so ago. I remember there was a photo, and I looked for it on your Instagram, couldn't find it, so I'm assuming it's on your Twitter, of like a town in Western Ukraine, and the streets, everyone was sitting outside at cafes. The streets had like nice, it could have been Paris, or it could have been Vienna, or it could have been somewhere like that. And it looked so kind of normal, European stuff going on. But then equally, there's this photo, and that's, I guess, the juxtaposition of the life you're living at the moment, and why we're keen to keep hearing your stories and following you as you do things. So thanks for giving us some time today. It's been a great pleasure. Is there anything you want to leave us with? Is there anything else we need to know?
I mean, I guess I just make the same point that I try and make last time, is that I hope people don't sort of forget about what's going on here, because it is quite easy to just sort of, forget, and Ukraine or whichever other conflict just becomes that carnage in some part of the world that we don't really recognize. But there still is an awful lot going on here, and still a lot of important stories that need to be told, and hopefully I'll be here telling those.
Cool. Tom Mutch, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. Stay safe, be well, and we will talk again sometime, I'm sure.
I'm sure we will. Thanks very much for having me.